Text Talks.
Hello!
I'm Alex,
And I'm Katie.
and this is Text Talks.
Yeah, welcome.
So, I'm going to hand straight over to you, Katie. What are we talking about today?
So today we're looking at Shruti and Smriti texts. So they're both different types of texts in the Hindu tradition. And then we're also going to look at sources of authority, how these type of texts provide different sources of authority, both between them and within their own traditions. So we're going to look more specifically at what we call the epics, so the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and how these are experienced and retold in different ways. And we're going to start back when they were first written down and lead all the way up to contemporary tellings of these texts.
Awesome.
So to start off, what is the difference between Shruti and Smriti? So Shruti is the older type of text, and it literally means that which is heard. So Shruti texts are authorless and they're not written down anywhere.
So, how do we still know about them then, if they're not written anywhere?
Because they are sung, and that's how they're preserved. And actually, they can be more reliable. The theory is that they're more reliable than written as text, because the way they're sung preserves them and makes sure that their meaning or the words don't change over time. You know, sometimes if you write something down and then you write it down again, it might change ever so slightly, and the more this happens, the more you might find that the story has moved further and further away from the original meaning of the text. The method in which these texts are sung allows them to stay the same, essentially.
So it's a memory technique almost.
It's a memory technique, yeah. I mean, obviously they are written down in places, you know, they do have them written down, but the traditional way in which they are preserved is sung or through a spoken tradition. And examples of Shruti texts are the Vedas, and most famously the Upanishads, which are the later stages of the Vedas. So the other version of, or the other type of text, are called Smriti texts, and that literally means that which is remembered. These are authored, so there is often a named author for these texts, and they are written down.
So, going off your logic from the last one, are they not as well preserved then?
Well, yeah, in a way, and many people, or traditionally, the idea is that the Shruti texts are more authoritative for that very reason. So Smriti texts, because they're written down, and therefore they're written down in lots of different ways and they're retold in lots of different ways, they are derivative in nature, which means they've been inspired or come from something else, and then they can keep changing. And in fact, they initially were all inspired by the Shruti texts and the philosophy in the Vedas and the Upanishads. So these Smriti texts are told and then retold again and again, and sometimes the meaning does change a little bit, or sometimes the themes change, sometimes the main events change, and there is a lot more variety within the Smriti tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So the key examples of Smriti texts are the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Puranas.
And those are what you specialise in, right?
Yes, so I specialise in the Ramayana, and I've also done some work on the Mahabharata, and as I mentioned earlier, these are called the epics, and that's for the reason that they are epic stories. Both of them can take several bookshelves long to tell. You know, they're very, very long stories, and they're all encompassing of different themes, you know, family, politics, love, everything is included in the epic. That's sort of the point. Now, I mentioned earlier that in the Smriti tradition, stories are told and retold, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of that here, because key to both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata tradition is that they have like almost infinite number of tellings within those traditions. So you might know the story of either, but there's lots of different versions of that story, and bringing that into contemporary mediums that can include comic books, TVs, novels. It's not all just kind of the ancient Sanskrit versions of the text.
But then those aren't scripture, surely.
What, like the comic books
Yeah.
and the TV? Well, I mean, yes, in a way, no, or no, they're not in a way, but depending on who you ask, they could be, and that's because, as I said before, in Smriti, there's not necessarily one authority, or at least not universally. So if you ask any one person, you know, what's the most authoritative or best version of the Ramayana, they might have an answer because their family will have a particular version that they like to read, or even a region will have a particular version, but it's definitely not universal across everyone who reads these texts. And as I say, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of versions of these epics. And in fact, there's been a lot of debate over whether we can say that there is one authority, and actually any telling is a telling of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, no matter where it comes from, or the time, or the medium, and therefore any telling could be as authoritative as another. You could argue that one way to find an authority within a tradition is to look to the oldest text, like the first version of this story has some authority, surely. So to that we look for the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. We can't look to the original text because they were oral traditions. So the very first time that these stories were ever told are written down. We just don't know what they are, and they weren't sung and recorded like they were with the Shruti texts. They're just not known. They were told by people long time ago, and we don't have that. So all we can do is look to the first literary versions of these. So that's the first time they were actually written down. And so for the Ramayana, that's Valmiki's Ramayana. So Valmiki is the name of the narrator of that particular version of the text. And for the Mahabharata, it's Vyasa is the narrator. And so sometimes people consider these as the most authoritative text because, as I say, they were the first literary written down versions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're better. And in fact, while these are very, very well known versions, in North India, a much later medieval Ramayana by a narrator called Tulsidas is the most popular version. So not always the oldest version is the most popular. And some scholars have even argued that it might be elitist to view it this way, because just because it's the oldest doesn't make it the best, essentially. To help us understand this a little bit more, I have a little activity for you, Alex.
Oh, goody. Okay.
So I'm just going to give you a name, and I just want you to tell me exactly what you picture.
Okay.
Snow White.
Disney.
Okay. Batman.
A bat.
Okay. Interesting.
We didn't prep this. For anyone listening, this was not prepped.
Okay, let's leave it there, because I fear any more we might go even further off topic. So let's start with Snow White. You said Disney. Of course, for many people that's by far the most famous. There's also other versions of Snow White, such as the Universal Pictures one, and there are other versions of Snow White in contemporary television and film. But it was first written by the Brothers Grimm, the tellers of fairy tales. It's also been told in lots of different children's fairy tale books. However, what you remember is the Disney version, but that's not the oldest version, it's not the literary version, it's not even the original version, the original medium, because it was moved to film and cartoon. That shows how just because a text might be the oldest text, such as Brothers Grimm, doesn't mean it's the most important or most significant to a person's life.
I see. I now see where you're going with the Batman thing, not bats.
Bat was a bit... Bat threw me a little bit, so I was expecting you more to say perhaps one of the more recent depictions of Batman in film, so any of the recent DC
Christian
films. Bale, or even Lego Batman, my personal favourite. They're all different tellings of the story that was originally a comic book, but for most people... not everyone, but for most people, they think of the films rather than the comic books. And again, that shows how in a tradition where a story is told and retold, that happens to such a great extent that you begin to forget what the original story is, and also it becomes less important what the original story is. Rather, Batman or Spider-Man or Snow White, they're all part of a tradition in which the story is told so many times that you just have great variety. And whether you're interested in Lego or interested in reading comic books or interested in like the darker themes of some of the other Batman films and so on, you can find whatever suits your interests more in the different ways in which it's retold.
Mm-hmm.
And it's exactly the same for the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The tradition is just so vast and so varied that it isn't important anymore which one universally is the most authoritative or better, or however you want to say it. It's more of a personal decision to you which version of the story you follow.
So you don't have to read ancient Sanskrit to be able to experience these stories, is what you're saying?
Exactly, which is great because it makes them so accessible, because not everyone can read ancient Sanskrit. And one example of how accessible these stories are today is novelizations of them. So I've got an example of an author who has retold both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in novels. The Ramayana retelling, called The Forest of Enchantments, was written in 2019 or published in 2019. And her retelling of the Mahabharata, called The Palace of Illusions, was published in 2009. Both retell the story from the perspective of the main female character. So in the Ramayana, that's Sita, and in the Mahabharata, that's Draupadi. Divakaruni, the author, mostly stays very close to the traditions as they're generally known, or, the most common themes, but they're told from the female perspective. And this is interesting because while it tells the story and it's completely recognisable as the ancient story or the story as other versions will tell it, it reflects contemporary values, which is looking at a woman's perspective as opposed to other tellings which might show more of the man's perspective. And to show how she does this, I've got a quote from the author's note that Divakaruni has at the start of the retelling of the Ramayana, and it shows part of her motivation for telling the Ramayana from Sita's perspective. And she writes, Sita will fill the gaps between the adventures undertaken by the male characters in the epic, their victories and defeats. She'll tell us what inspired the crucial choices that directed the course of her life, what she believed in, what interested and moved her, how she felt when faced with the deepest of tragedies, and what gave her the ability to overcome them. Now, in this quote, Divakaruni is basically saying that her Sita, is going to provide all these unanswered questions. So in a lot of other versions of the Ramayana, not all of them, because I study a medieval telling that does show Sita's perspective, which actually has influenced Divakaruni in this telling. But anyway, a lot of other versions, especially the ancient Valmiki Ramayana, doesn't necessarily go into this much detail about Sita's experience, and that really reflects the contemporary interest in providing the experience of different people, especially with movements such as feminism, where it's more important to look at all the experience of people and not focus on one particular person, such as the male experience. And I think that really highlights how the Smriti tradition, even in contemporary times, continues to grow, and while still derivative from the ancient tradition, incorporates themes of its own audience. So our audience is interested in feminist themes, for example, so Divakaruni presents a telling that looks at the female perspective. And this has happened throughout all different tellings of these Smriti texts that incorporate new philosophies that their audience would be interested in. Now, I mentioned earlier that tellings of the epic have reached other mediums, including TV. And one of the most impactful tellings of the epics was through series that were released in the 1980s in India. So in 1987, a televised version of the Ramayana was released called The Ramayana, and it broke records. It was incredibly popular across India, broke loads of records. But interestingly, as a result of the COVID-19 lockdown, they aired it again in the past few months, and it broke even more records, actually having 77 million views on a single day, making it the most watched series in the history of the world.
What?
77 million viewers watching a single episode.
Wow.
For listeners, Alex is speechless here. his jaw dropped with 70. Yeah, and to give you something to compare that to, I looked up some other figures that we might be a bit more aware of. So the Bake Off finale, the last Bake Off, Great British Bake Off finale, had 7.7 million viewers.
So 10 times the amount of people.
10 times the amount, yeah. And the Game of Thrones most watched episodes had 13.6 million viewers.
So a fifth of.
So yeah. So, but yeah, the Reminer series reached 77 million viewers. So it makes me laugh though, because sometimes when I tell people what I do, they say, wow, you know, what I study. They're like, oh, that's so niche and how random. And it's like, yeah, it's really not that niche. A lot of people know this story. I'm just happen to be one of them. You know, it's not that obscure as people, I guess, in the West seem to think. And also the Mahabharata also had a series, and they re-aired it again during lockdown, which was the second most watched series, but, you know, still a very impressive.
Wow.
Yeah, very impressive feat. But so it's interesting to note how popular televised versions of these ancient epics are, and it continues to show how Smriti texts can grow and change and adapt to the audience that they want to appeal to, and it just further shows the variety of the tradition, and that even as a TV series it's very different from a Sanskrit epic written down many years ago, it can still have an authority in a person's life. And clearly for 77 million people
On one day.
on a single day, there was an air of authority there. So I think the main takeaways from this podcast are the difference between Shruti and Smriti, and obviously I've focused a lot more on Smriti in the podcast, but that they can be authoritative in different ways. So Shruti had authority for being, you know, not changing too much, being preserved, being very, very old, whereas Smriti has authority in a different way, in that its tradition is incredibly diverse and vast, and actually works really well in comparison to the religious diversity and pluralism within the Hindu tradition. But also that as these tellings, these Smriti tellings, particularly the epics, are retold, they incorporate the values of the audience that they are being retold for. So in the medieval era, when certain philosophical movements were popular, such as Vaishnava or Shakta or Bhakti, the tellings begin to take on those themes. And as I talked about in this podcast, when we reach the contemporary era, the tellings begin to take on contemporary themes such as feminism, as I showed in Divakaruni's novels. So overall it shows how sources of authority can be found in many, many different places in the Hindu literary tradition, and this can shift depending on your audience, depending on your personal experience, where you come from, what your family is interested in.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if you've got any further questions or want to get in contact us on Facebook at Text Talks or on Twitter at
Text Talks 1.
Yeah. And we hope to hear from you soon.